This episode of Make Something Cool is brought to you by Riverside, the leading podcast and video recording platform. We are massive fans of Riverside. We literally use it to make every episode of Make Something Cool. We can't live without it anymore. And we are not the only ones. Guy Raz of How I Built This uses it. Gary Vee uses it. Companies like Spotify and the New York Times use it. It's the best. So if you are trying to record a podcast or create video content, go check out Riverside today. You can hit the link in the description and the show notes of this episode to go check it out. We couldn't recommend it enough. So go check out Riverside. This is Make Something Cool, and I am Alex Sugg. Today, I am sitting down with Oliver Burkeman. Oliver is a journalist and a writer, and today we are going to talk about his new book about time management. And I am really excited to hear from you, Oliver, because, I mean, time management is something that really, it's on everybody's mind all the time, but I think especially for creators, we never feel like there's enough time. So I'm excited to talk to you. Thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
Sure. So the title of your book is really striking to me, and I purposely didn't mention it at the top because I wanted you to kind of explain it. So maybe let's start there. What is the book called, and where did the title come from?
It's called 4,000 Weeks, and the subtitle is Time Management for Mortals. 4,000 weeks is very approximately the lifespan of the average person in the West, expressed in terms of weeks. Obviously, you don't know how many you're going to get. People get far fewer and far more than that. But even so, it's pretty stark, I think. Really, I hope it draws attention to the extreme finiteness of life. And a bit of a risky title because I think, panics people, and I hope it doesn't panic them all the way to not wanting to have anything to do with a book that has that title. That would be a commercially unwise decision. But yeah, and then Time Management for Mortals, which is the subtitle in the US anyway. They went with something different in the UK. It's just my sort of attempt to, I guess, define the subject matter here, which for me is very much about bringing together the ground level day-to-day question of, okay, it's 9 a.m. What do I do today? How do I schedule my day? How do I organize my tasks? All the rest of it with, the ultimate, the big cosmic questions, the reason we're doing any of this in the first place, which is sort of to try to make some meaning in the weeks we have before it's all over.
Right.
So that sort of high and low thing. I mean, I feel like that's kind of a motif in the writing I tried to do, sort of bring big philosophical ideas to bear on like how you actually do stuff.
Totally.
On a day-to-day basis.
That's a huge theme that I got when I read the book. And I felt like we as people, I just feel like there is this, I don't know, when you think of it in terms of, 4,000 weeks, 80 years, but I think the 4,000 weeks number was really striking to me because it's so puny sounding. It's just so small, and it's a little bit terrifying put in those terms of like, cool, 4,000 weeks is the average or whatever. And I think that really puts a lot into perspective when you think of it that way, because it's like, what am I spending my time doing? Am I just like, time becomes a lot more precious, put in those cosmic big terms, Yeah,
and I think the week thing, I mean, I sort of stumbled on this. I don't take huge amount of sort of credit for it or anything, but it's really interesting because if you express it in days, you get a very, very big number. And days seem, we all feel like a day goes by in no time at all, and you waste days all the time, or I do anyway. But you get this huge number of them. On the other hand, a year, you don't get very many at all, but it's a huge amount of time. And the week really pushes the point that it's like a week is something small enough that it kind of is easy for quite a few of them to go by and you're not quite sure what you did with them. But on the other hand, the number 4,000 just isn't big enough then, really, like if there's a quantity of those tiny things. So it sort of pushes the point home.
Right. It does. Yeah. And I think that contrast of the cosmic, what the hell are we all doing running around on this planet in our very short period of time? There's a lot going on under the surface there of like, our purpose, legacy. Are we trying to like leave things behind? Like, what are we all running around doing with our time? I think there's a lot of kind of built-in pressure there. And you describe that in the book, that like a long time ago, people didn't think of time in the way that we think of it now. It wasn't like there was this constant feeling of there's not enough of it. Yeah, maybe
Right.
describe that for me really quick. It's just like the contrast between now and then and how we think of time now versus in history.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots that have sort of gone wrong in the way we think about time, and I'm sure we'll come to that. But there's this kind of fundamental, basic thing that you're referring to there, which is maybe not something that's gone wrong, but it's a particular way that we think about time today that is so endemic, so second nature that we're like fish in water. We can't see that that's what we're doing, and that is just this whole idea that time is like a thing separate from you in the first place, that you can either use well or use unwisely or waste or get more efficient or productive with, like as a resource. You get this idea cropping up as far back as sort of ancient Greece and Rome. But I think that if you had sort of walked up to a English medieval peasant, in early medieval times in England and talked in these terms, it would have made no sense at all. These were people, and this is true of all sorts of cultures at different points in history, these were people who, like, time was just the medium in which life unfolded. Anthropologists call this task orientation instead of time orientation. So it's a way of living where the rhythms of life just emerge from what you got to do in your life, right? And you're so sort of closely tied to nature and the natural world that you just do things when they need doing. You don't have this sense in your head of like some kind of calendar or a timeline or a yardstick or some other kind of spatial metaphor, and you're trying to keep up, or you're waiting for something to happen. All those kind of ideas that we have, and the idea of being sort of hounded by time that so many of us feel today, they're all premised on this notion that like there's time and there's you, and you're in some kind of relationship. And I don't think that idea would have occurred to, for example, a medieval peasant, right? If you had, as a productivity guru, had gone up to a dairy farmer then, or even to some extent a dairy farmer now, and said like, batching tasks is the way to be super efficient. So why don't you do all the milking of the cows for the next 6 months in a couple of days? Like, that's not how it works. You just got to milk the cows when they need milking. And, in those sort of traditional societies, almost everything just needs doing when it needs doing. And there are downsides to that, a lack of autonomy and freedom, I suppose. But the big upside is that you're not in a kind of alienated relationship with time. You're not like, am I using it well enough? Am I going to have enough of it to fit in everything I need to do by Friday afternoon? All of that is just not on the table to begin with. And I think it's a much more peaceful way of being in time. Although there were, other than that, you don't want to go back to the life of an English medieval peasant.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. But yeah, I mean, I think this strikes me so much personally. I've been told my whole life, and I know it about myself, is just like efficiency is something I'm probably unhealthily obsessed with in my own life. Of, if we're basically like, my wife and I will be leaving the house, and we're going to walk to somewhere down the street or somewhere around the corner. And to me, it's like, I have to open Google Maps to find the quickest route. And then like in my mind's turning like, well, is Google right about this, or is there a faster way? Like, this is just my curse and how my mind thinks. And that, that kind of expands beyond just little instances like that. It's just kind of how I see the world. And in a way, I've learned over the past few years, disease is a wrong term. Obviously, it's not clinical or anything, but it feels like some sort of curse or disease for my life's well-being, in a sense, because, in a lot of ways, I've tried to expand my mindfulness, meditation practice, things like that, to really kind of bring me back to the present moment, because I'm always so obsessed with the future. My relationship to time is oriented to the future, just always. So it's really hard for me to be here now, and that's a hard, not very fulfilling way to live. I've had those nightmares of the classic stories where people are on their deathbed and they're like, I wouldn't have wanted more time doing work. I would want more time with my family and friends type scenarios. Like, I've had that nightmare, and like, I've spent so much time the past few years like, cool, how do I get present? How do I, change this? How do I go back to kind of that, to your point, the peasant way of thinking of my relationship to time? I'm curious, in the modern world, and maybe this is something you can speak to, how do we get back to a better relationship with time when the demands of life, or our perceived demands of the world, are the way they are? Like, what are some things we can do to not live so much in the future and think about our time as like this thing outside of ourselves, but to be a little bit more present state with time. Like what did you learn about that?
Well, this really gets into what I think of as the sort of core message of the book, but it bears saying that, like, you know, everything you talk about there is like, me too. And you don't end up writing a book like this unless you've had all those same struggles. And frankly, not only had, but I'm not going to even claim that now I'm in some kind of perfect relationship with time. And we can talk, there's lots in the book about how that sort of focus on efficiency per se is really counterproductive. I don't think there's anything wrong with making certain processes in your life more efficient, but pursuing efficiency for its own sake has a lot of pitfalls. But I think the basic problem that it's sort of universal, but I think in people like the way you describe yourself and in me as a particular kind of flavor of it, it's that we're trying to get ourselves into a position of being in control of our time and sort of mastering our time in a particular sense that is, you know, spoiler alert, is not possible, that you actually just systematically can't achieve. So this is, you know, if you're pursuing a productivity approach with the idea that one day you're going to be able to stay on top of everything, that there's going to be, you know, any goal that comes to your mind or obligation that you feel you're going to be able to execute by definition, or that you know how your future's going to unfold because you've planned things to within an inch of their lives, and you just have a whole plan for how the year is going to unfold, and you're going to hit all your targets and meet all your goals. Or I would say in the case of like Google mapping a route somewhere, like that feeling of certainty that you're not wasting any time because you know 100% that you're taking the most efficient route. All of these, I think, are manifestations of trying to get a certain kind of control over time, which the psychological root of is basically not wanting to face the fact that time is limited, that time is going to win the battle in the end one day, and that we can't control the future that much. We can't come up with a system that will make us capable of infinite productivity and infinite, completion of tasks, because we are finite. So there's always going to be tough choices. There's always going to be stuff you can't do if you're going to do something else with that finite bit of time. So there's this kind of deep sort of need to feel like you are on top of everything, and like you have got your life sorted out, that we never actually get to, but we're constantly thinking it's like next week or next month, or maybe if I like put in a lot more effort over the next 6 months, I'm going to finally sort of lever myself into this position. And I think it manifests in lots of different ways. But one of the messages of the book, I guess, is like when you see that things like that are impossible, not that you just haven't got there yet, or that you haven't found enough self-discipline or the right techniques, but that actually there's a certain kind of goal here that isn't just not on the cards for human beings. That is actually one way to start to fall back into a much healthier relationship with time, right? Because I'm trying to think of a way to make this a bit more specific and vivid, but like if you think that you are going to be able to complete 20 really major projects over the next 6 months, and you're constantly struggling to try to feel like you are in position to do that, then you're going to be distracted from whatever project you're working on. You're going to be constantly trying to game your schedule in some cunning way. You're going to constantly feel anxiety and stress because you're going to be looking down the pipe that actually there isn't enough time for all these things. If you sort of can admit defeat, in a sense, I know that sounds sort of pessimistic, I don't think it is. If you can sort of admit defeat about the 20 projects and see that you're going to have to neglect many of them, it's actually a lot easier then to find absorption in doing and making progress with 2 or 3 of those projects, and actually getting somewhere, being sort of in the experience instead of constantly in this sort of trying to get out of the experience in order to do the sort of air traffic control with your schedule and try to figure out if you can do everything. So it is a kind of defeat. It's a kind of a surrender to the reality of the situation, but I think it's a defeat that is the prelude to greater productivity and greater accomplishment and greater fulfillment, right? It's not a recipe for despair. It's like, stop trying to do impossible things with your time so that you can do really cool, possible things with your time, I guess is the overview.
Definitely. Yeah. It's really just about getting honest about death. and like, I think that in a way that's a real core message of your book. And you put it a lot more eloquently than that. But I think like for me, that whole time, that's kind of And again, that's been a theme. I think something I've been really thinking about over the past few years is like, you know, mortality is a big deal to think about. And I have a few questions on this later that I want to go over. But I do think like accept, like kind of what you said, surrendering or accepting, like that acceptance of this is what I have now, and I have to choose wisely what I spend my time on. And I do think like the internet world, you know, I interviewed Jack Butcher. He's this amazing designer. He has a thing called Visualize Value. He's a few episodes back, but when we spoke, we talked a lot about like specialization versus generalization, and how right now everybody can be a quote unquote generalist, where you kind of can do a lot of everything, especially online in the creative world. But like, who goes really far and is usually really fulfilled are people who specialize in one or two things, and they just go really deep into one of those. And I think in a certain sense, it's kind of what you're suggesting is like, we can stretch ourselves to these crazy limits, but it's never going to solve what we're actually seeking. When we're trying to do everything all at once, we're really just kind of chasing a thing that we'll never catch. It's like trying to catch smoke or something. You're never going to actually get there. But you did mention right before that last explanation that there were problems with pursuing efficiency for efficiency's sake. What are some problems in that?
Well, I think the basic idea, people sort of understand this on a gut level, I think, even if they haven't always articulated it to themselves. But the basic idea is just that if you take some system and you make it more efficient, it could be your personal productivity system, but it occurs in lots of other areas of life as well. If you make it more efficient without concern for any other kind of guiding value, you're not particularly trying to achieve anything except more efficiency, what happens is the system attracts more inputs and sort of lower quality inputs. So the way that I would say that in the concrete terms of work, say, is like, if all you do is try to get more efficient at work, you're going to find yourself busier, and you're going to find yourself busier with less meaningful stuff. Because, I mean, this crops up famously as what gets called Parkinson's law, right? The idea that work expands to fill the time available for its completion. If you get really efficient at processing email, what happens, as I know from experience and write about in the book, is that you just get a lot more email because you reply and then people reply, and
right.
You get a reputation for being responsive to email, so more people send it to you. If you're working in like an office job and you get a reputation as being the person who can dispatch a project in half the time of anyone else, well, you're going to get a ton more projects to deal with. And that might be what you want, sure, but it's not going to be peace of mind or extra time. It's going to be the opposite. It's going to be filling up the system, because you're creating new capacity, which, all else being equal, will get used.
Right.
A good analogy that people are aware of is this idea of induced demand in traffic, right? So that they sometimes put an extra lane on a freeway to try to ease congestion, and then that makes that route more attractive to more drivers.
Right.
So more cars come and use the route, and then in the worst case, the congestion is just as bad as it was. Just takes an extra lane of congestion.
Yeah.
And you find this same pattern occurring over and over again. So basically my argument there when it comes to sort of personal work and productivity is, it's not like you shouldn't ever try to get more efficient. If it's taking you an hour and a half to like find your clothes in the morning or something, you probably need to make your morning routine more efficient. But your goal in the work that matters to you should not be primarily to find ways to do more things without regard to whether they're like good things to do. What it actually needs to be, I think, and that's certainly been the case for me, is it actually needs to be a kind of tolerance of the anxiety of not doing things. So it needs to be like, okay, I've got tons of email and needing answers, and there are 50 projects, maybe that's an exaggeration, that strike me as really meaningful ways that I could use my day. So if I'm going to actually pick one of those and work on it, one of the big skills I'm going to have to develop is to tolerate the sort of anxiety in the background of like, oh my God, I'm neglecting all those things that would be useful or important to do. But that's built into the situation, right? That we are humans with these like minds that can come up with an infinite amount of ambitions or feel an infinite amount of duty and obligation, depending on your personality, I guess. But ultimately just material creatures who can only do a small amount of that. So there's this kind of permanent mismatch that you have to just kind of get used to, the fact that it feels uncomfortable. Because if instead you think to yourself, well, okay, I've got to find a way to do everything that feels like it matters, you're just going to be, constantly running up against the fact that you're trying to make 2 + 2 add up to 5.
Right.
Yeah, I think this kind of just, you talked about confronting death, and I think ultimately that obviously is what this is about, but I would be being dishonest if I implied that like I have come to terms with mortality in some particularly impressive way. That sort of, that big, rather melodramatic question of death, like that's a big thing. One of the consequences of the fact that we die is just this more sort of low-level discomfort on a day-to-day basis that you kind of want to be doing more than you actually have time to do. And there it's not about facing some huge horrific fear. There it's just about getting comfortable with a certain kind of discomfort that comes from, spending 4 hours of your day focused on something you really care about when you know that there are other good alternatives that you're neglecting, and seeing that like there are always going to be other good alternatives that you're neglecting. This is not because you haven't found the right productivity system yet.
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, this is kind of the hinge point of the book, but I'm curious. So when you've accepted those limitations, how does somebody effectively choose the right thing to work on? When you have the 50 things, like what in your mind, what's the criteria? What in your mind like makes something the most important thing?
That's a really good question, which does not mean to say that I have a really good answer. I think the first part of the answer is actually that a lot of the time people have a good intuitive sense of it. And the stuff that we're talking about here about sort of dropping the struggle for perfect efficiency and all the rest of it, that's a matter of sort of clearing away the fog. So it's like on some level, you know what excites you and where you find meaning in life. Obviously, not everyone has the autonomy to just pursue that. I get that. But let's talk in the ideal case for now. You sort of have a good sense of the things that are really cool ways to be spending your time and the things that aren't. And what gets in the way is this notion that, in fact, you've got to find a way to do all the things. That anything that gets thrown at you has to find a place in the system. So that's the first thing to say. Like, I think people should have a bit more confidence that they already know the answer to this question, and that actually it's like a certain kind of illusion of attempted control is getting in the way of them seeing what they already know. But that's not my only answer. I think that'd be a bit of a cop-out if that was all it was. Beyond that, I think that this discomfort that we're talking about, this fact that, there's a discomfort involved in choosing and making the choices that you have to make in a finite life, that can actually be a really interesting guide, because there's a good reason, as I also write about in the book, there's a good reason why the things we really care about make us kind of on some level uncomfortable. Not the kind of discomfort where you're in a sort of terribly toxic job or toxic relationship and you need to get out. I think people can identify the difference here. But that kind of discomfort comes from not knowing if you have what it takes to pull it off, not knowing if it's going to be well received by other people, and sort of understanding that discomfort is its own strange kind of guide to the fact that, like, for you, the stakes are high on this one. And the stakes are high because it's something that's very close to your heart. Just to give a sort of slightly more specific answer then, finally on this question, I suppose, I do talk in the book about this great question that I took from the Jungian therapist, James Hollis, who suggests that you should ask about life paths and choices between projects and things. Does this path enlarge me or diminish me? Instead of, would this make me happier? Or would this make me, better off financially or something? This kind of slightly mysterious question that, in fact, as he argues, and I agree, most people do have an intuitive sense of the answer to that. And it's really clever because it doesn't sort of end run around this problem of like, what's going to make you happier? We're terrible at predicting what's going to make us happy. Yeah. This is famous finding from social psychology. And furthermore, like, some things make you happy, but they're kind of meaningless. And some things make you kind of a little bit unhappy in the doing of them, but they're clearly meaningful activities. And so this sense of enlargement versus diminishment, I think it's so powerful. You kind of know if, say, a professional role you might be in and it's challenging you, whether the challenges it's throwing at you are the kind that are helping you grow as a person or the kind that is making your soul shrivel. And I've had faced that myself at a number of sort of inflection points in life where you're like, oh, yeah, staying in the situation or leaving the situation would be tough, but kind of a good toughness, like the kind of a toughness I need. And then in another case, it might be like, no, like this is played out. This is done, and it's time to move on to something else.
Yeah, I love that, the enlargement idea. It's almost, I've kind of thought about that, and in my mind, it's always been like the difference between fulfillment versus fun.
Right.
I think like a lot of us are chasing fun, or what we imagine fun might be, or easy or simple, when what we're really pursuing is fulfillment or meaning. And I think that question, that prompt of, does this enlarge my life or not, or who I am? Like, I think that's such a better question than like trying to chase happiness, whatever that really means, because in so many ways, it's like happiness has become kind of a little bit of a flimsy term to go chase. It's really not very useful in that sense. Whereas like
totally
what you're saying and what Hollis said is, it's not just about being happy and comfortable. It's about challenging yourself to go to a greater depth into yourself to this, which is ultimately what I think is fulfilling, especially in, who the show is for creators. It's like, we all desire to go to a deeper place as we move forward in our life. We all desire to, I think there's like a sense of, we desire to be brave in what we pursue. And that's a very human instinct, just like that thinking in stories. Like, we all are, the character on our own story. And it's a pretty lame story if you're not courageously pursuing something and solving some big problem on your journey like that. That's what we all really deep down desire. And I think that prompt is so helpful to think about that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And yeah, it's growth, isn't it? It's whether it's got that growth movement in it rather than something you're doing. A word that the Jungian psychologists love to use all the time as well is it generative? Is it generative? Or you might think sort of, is the soil you're working with fertile? There's the kind of various different words you can think about here. And they're so right. People want to be doing things that count as that. Now, I don't think it necessarily means, this is a whole other part of the book, but like, doesn't necessarily mean it has to be extraordinarily unusual or result in millions of people celebrating you or anything like that. But it needs to have, like, again, we're all just using proxy terms here, but it needs to have juice. It needs to have, it needs to have that thing that is not sort of ossified. And so, you don't want to chase happiness for its own sake, because that can be very sort of calcifying and kind of dead in a way. You also don't want to chase discomfort for its own sake, which, sometimes what I write, I think, can get misinterpreted that way. You don't just do things you hate because then you get to tough it out and prove that you're able to do terrible things. Like, it's neither of those. It's the idea that the path towards what matters to you and through what matters to you is going to take you through moments of happiness and moments of discomfort. And you sort of have to take the rough with the smooth.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I think to that point, sometimes it's almost the opposite. So a lot of people are chasing, millions of dollars or millions of people following their work or some giant audience or giant dollar amount or giant life, whatever. And I think a lot of times the growth path looks like going small, like almost going the opposite way and purely just out of the health for yourself. And like that, you're not like, things like that don't really define us, and they shouldn't define us. And it's really healthy to go, like, that's been for me just one of the most healthy things, is to think like, I don't need to think about myself with these crazy expectations. It's a lot healthier to actually go smaller in a lot of ways, a lot of the time. Like, I think ambition's amazing. It's great. I have big dreams. We all should have big dreams. But at the same time, the fun or the imaginary happy path looks like pursue millions of dollars, millions of followers, millions of whatever, when in reality, it's like fulfillment might look the complete opposite way. Like, there are lots of very wealthy people who are very anonymous out there, because they know like certain paths won't lead to happiness at all, and it's just, that whole idea is really interesting about focusing on like growth instead of what we imagine happiness might look like. But Hey everyone, we'll be right back with the episode, but really quick, I have to tell you about Riverside, the leading podcast and video platform in the world. And truthfully, we love Riverside, and we used it way before we even talked to them about becoming a sponsor for literally every episode of Make Something Cool. We cannot do what we do without it. And the reason we love it so much is it's a lot like Zoom, but I can record much higher quality audio and video on their platform. And what's amazing is it doesn't matter where the guest is located. It sounds like we're sitting in the room together while we're recording. It's amazing. And so right after you're done recording, you download separate audio and video tracks from the Riverside platform, and you can easily edit your content from within the online platform if you want. It's so easy. It's seamless. We use it all the time. Josh, my producer, he's in Riverside editing, gathering files, and it makes all of our process so seamless and easy every single week. And we're not the only ones who love Riverside. There are over 70,000 people, ranging from individual creators to the big podcasts like Guy Raz, Gary Vee, Spotify, the New York Times. And the reason why so many people are switching to Riverside is because it's really, really good and easy and simple to use. So please go check them out today. You can hit the link in the description of the show notes, or you can just head over to riverside.fm, create an account, and get started today. Okay, back to the episode. In your book, you had, at the end, I felt like it was very, very helpful in a very concise way to kind of frame a lot of these ideas that we're talking about. Basically, there were 10 tools for embracing our finitude. So I think for the remainder of our conversation, it'd be fun to kind of go through these 10 things if you're game. And
Sure.
Yeah, maybe let's just start with that top one.
Right. Adopting a fixed volume approach to creativity. So on the first couple of these, as I say in the book, there's a certain amount of credit is due to Cal Newport, and I'm sure you and your listeners will be familiar with the author of the book Deep Work and others, because he's sort of taken some of these into very specific practical directions. But what I'm really getting at here is just almost any approach to productivity and creativity is going to suit you better if it sort of starts with the amount of time you have and then proceeds to the question, what are the most important things to do with that time, rather than if it starts with the tasks and says, okay, somehow I've got to get through all these things in the next day or 6 months,
right? And
I've just got to find a way. So if you sort of select time boxing, the obvious example of this, right? If you sort of decide what hours are going to be available to you in the day for work, or figure out what hours are available to you if there are other constraints on it, and then given that portion of time, figure out which things matter the most to do in that time, and sort of resign yourself to the fact that you're going to let the chips fall where they will when it comes to all the other stuff, right? Because the alternative to that is this kind of approach that I refer to in the book and other people call, clearing the decks. Get in the morning, first of all, try to deal with all outstanding little issues so you can get to this great expanse of time where you're going to be able to focus on your creating. And
eat the frog.
Happens.
Isn't that the term? Eat the frog.
Well, eating the frog, I think, is broadly, I'm a little bit rude about Brian Tracy in this book, who I associate with that phrase, but eating the frog is actually, I would say, is in tune with what I'm saying here, right? It's not necessarily do the most unpleasant thing first, but do the thing you care about the most first, even if it's not fun, I would say. So maybe that's not eating a frog, but there's something related here. And then just sort of any approach that involves limiting your work in progress, that involves taking everything that's on your plate and saying, okay, almost all of it is going to have to wait. These are the 4 things I'm doing right now. And I'm going to deal with the fact that I kind of wish I was doing 20 of them and it makes me feel anxious, but I'm going to deal with that and just do some of these. So a very simple approach that I outline in this section in the book is, one way you could do this is you just keep 2 to-do lists. One is kind of infinitely long. You add everything that's on your plate. It might have hundreds of items on it, sure. The other one has, let's say, 5 slots. And you move 5 items from the long list to the short one. And the rule is you don't get to move another one on until you've freed up a slot by doing one. So you're sort of creating this artificial bottleneck in your task flow, or you could do that on the level of projects. It's like only these 3 projects are getting my sort of primary attention. Obviously, people have all sorts of little bits of admin they have to do on day-to-day in addition. But there is a approach that also I'm sure people are familiar with, of like the Kanban approach that's been adapted into this personal Kanban approach by a guy called Jim Benson, who I write about, where you sort of move Post-its across a board that's divided into columns, or you do the same in an app on your computer. All of these things, like, you can geek out for far too long on the specifics and end up wasting a year of your life just getting the productivity system in place. But all of them have this one fundamental principle that sure, there are like 50 things you would like to do today and move forward on if you could, but you have to make a radical limit to how many you're actually going to try to move forward on, and not bring the other ones onto the plate until one of them is cleared. And you actually do, in aggregate, make a lot more progress this way, right? This is a more productive way to live. It's not just that it's less sort of mentally tormenting.
Well, it's so much
if you try to work on all 50, what happens is every time one gets a little difficult, you just bounce off onto another one.
Exactly.
So you never actually go through the difficult stuff.
Yeah, it's super focused, comparatively speaking. Because if you have infinite options, you don't go deep and get anything done on one or two of those things. So,
right, exactly. Yeah. Number 2.
Let's go to number 2. Yeah.
This is serialize. I guess that's actually very closely related. This is why I put them together to what we just discussed. But this is just the idea of, again, it's more of a sort of general shift than maybe a hyper-specific technique. But it's this idea of thinking of the work you do, especially when it comes to the major projects you do, as things that you do one at a time, and then you move to the next one, and then you move to the next one, and they have to like queue up. And you have to sort of be okay with the fact that they're queuing up. So one way to do this is to pick, if you possibly can within your work life, pick one major project that you're working on. And sure, you're going to have to spend part of the day on little stuff. No line of work, I think, is free of that. But you can say, in my case, for example, be like, okay, I'm going to write this chapter, and that is my focus for now. And I don't get to do these other 6 things that are really important to me until this chapter is written. And then I'm going to pick another one of these things and do that and move it through. And sure, maybe 2 hours a day have to be on email and a bunch of other stuff. It's not a sort of perfect system. And in fact, chasing perfectionism with it is kind of the same problem that we're talking about here. But, and you can even sort of do this with your whole life, right? You can sort of divide your life into sort of approximate domains: work, family, the house and domestic kind of, home repairs, stuff like that, finances, and not too many domains, and sort of nominate one primary focus in each. In case you can't tell from the way I'm talking about these techniques, I never do feel super doctrinaire about like, here is my system, you must implement it.
Yeah.
I kind of feel like the people listening to this and people who are interested in stuff in general, they're easily smart enough to come up with techniques of their own. And they've also probably got about 50 pages, web pages bookmarked full of like 50 techniques. So that the important thing is seeing which ones play to this like fate, which ones sort of encourage you to sort of lean in a bit to the fact that you're finite, that it's uncomfortable, versus these ones, the very deceptive, dangerous ones that fuel this illusion that like next month, next year, you're finally going to get into this position of like being God, basically.
Yeah.
So I'm very fond of the way that Jessica Abel, who's a creativity coach and a graphic novelist, describes one version of this technique, which is just paying yourself first when it comes to time. This is an old bit of wisdom from personal finance, right? That if you want to save money or invest money, you should take off a bit of your paycheck or your income as soon as you get it, instead of
waiting till everything's
buying groceries and paying everything else and then hoping there's some left over. And she makes the same point, right? If there's something you really care about, you just have to like do a bit of it now, today.
That's good.
And not wait till, you've dealt with all the other demands on your time, because you never will get to this point of having dealt with all the other demands on your time.
Yeah. I've heard, that's such a good way to put it. I've heard Seth Godin put it in kind of a very similar, but he was talking about it more in like the terms of giving yourself the best time. And he's talking to people trying to build products and create things and things like that. But he kind of reoriented, like, instead of like planning your whole day around what you're busy with. So like if it's work or school or whatever's going on, plan it around what you want to plan it around, because, the work day is only 8 hours long. and you have 16 other hours to play with that you get to control that time, at least for most people. And obviously there are exceptions to that rule, but it just, and he's like, you get to decide, you get to make these choices. And I think what she said as well, just like paying yourself first, making that kind of like, because it's so easy to just like walk through life checking off all these boxes all the time. And then before you know it, however much time has passed you, and you're like, I haven't done anything for me. And there's still this gnawing, frustrating feeling that I haven't achieved anything that I really want to, that's fulfilling to me. And so that idea of like, even just, for me, I always tell people, give yourself 10 minutes a day just to start. And because there's also just the hurdle of starting can feel scary. But it's like, man, if you just give yourself 10 minutes is all you need. And it's crazy what you can do in 10 minutes a day for a year's time if you just like do it. I know it's easier said than done, but.
No, that's totally true. I'm a big believer in like getting ridiculously small with the goal the time goal that you're aiming for if it's hard to get started. The other thing that I'm sort of always going on about for people who are, for people whose work is in some sense creative or involves deep thinking or whatever, if you're doing this kind of thing as a full-time job, obviously it's different if you're trying to fit it in around other things, but like you can own pretty much, I feel like the evidence is fairly clear, both anecdotally from all sorts of famous artists and authors and other scientists in history, but also from more sort of rigorous research. You can only really do that kind of deep, focused thinking work for 3 or 4 hours a day.
Yes.
Maximum.
Yeah.
And so, in the best case scenario here, in the worst case, 10 minutes, totally. But in the best case scenario here, like if you have total freedom over your day and you're lucky enough to make your main income from something creative and absorbing, as I am, like even then, just don't try and do it for 8 hours a day, because that is going to be such a frustrating and ultimately counterproductive approach. Right. And you've got plenty of things, or I have, that you need to be doing for work with the other hours anyway, just sort of shallower things that you can't get rid of, and more social things, meetings and conversations and things that you don't need quite the same level of silent focus for. So my schedule, when it's working well, it is basically just a question of ring fencing 3 or 4 hours each morning, trying very hard not to make appointments for those times.
Yeah.
And if I can do that and focus in that time and move the needle on something I'm working on, like that has to be counted a huge victory. Like that should not be seen as what you only did it for 3 hours. No, like
that's
not at all,
massive.
Because,
3 hours. That's a huge.
And it's the
deal.
best case scenario. I would like to stress.
Right.
Shall I move on?
Yeah, let's do it.
Number 3 is decide in advance what to fail at.
Wow.
Another approach here that's totally in keeping with this kind of embrace your limitations in order to really pour your energy and attention into a few things you care about. This specific idea, partly from a writer called John Acuff. The idea here is that given the situation we're in, finite time, infinite ambitions, a culture that sort of pushes an infinite amount of obligations onto us, or feeling that we could or ought to be doing an infinite number of things, like you're going to be failing at any point to be doing plenty of things that might be good to do. If you can sort of pick some domains in advance where you're not even going to try to excel, that's incredibly empowering, because then you don't sort of spread your energy thinly and then get really disappointed when you turn out to not do much in certain domains. You're like, no, not even fighting that fight.
Right.
There are limits. Obviously, you can't sort of like decide not to bother feeding your children for 6 months while you work on a work project, whatever. But there are all sorts of ways you can do this. You can do it for a few months at a time. You can sort of say, you know what? We're not the family with the tidy house and apartment right now, because being present with the kids and doing these work projects, that matters more. You can be, I think people early in their adulthood and careers, it's often perfectly appropriate to sort of really double down on work and not spend all that much time doing other stuff. Maybe you're going to say, well, I'm going to do enough. I'm going to stay fit. I'm going to exercise enough to be healthy, but I'm not going to be training for 10Ks or whatever for now. And you can do this on a cyclical basis, right? You can put a note in your calendar. You can be like, this is my approach for the next 3 months or next 6 months. That way you don't need to worry that you're going to sort of accidentally forget ever to train for 10Ks or, I don't know, date or any of these other things that you can just sort of put on. You're just putting them on hold for a while. They can be very small as well. I mean, I have ambitions to be able to cook in a non-incompetent fashion.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think I do okay when it's my turn to cook dinner. I think our son gets and my wife, I think they get a perfectly nutritious meal from me, but there is nothing, there's no flair involved.
Yeah.
It's extremely dull. And I think that would take time and energy and attention. And it's just right now, that's a good thing to decide in advance that is not going to happen.
That's so good though. That's such a good frame.
I think it's really useful and you know, it takes a little bit of doing, because if you're sort of a control freak or a neat freak or a person who wants to be achieving in all areas, it can be hard to take. But the point is, you're going to be failing anyway at something if you are successfully focusing your attention on a few things that matter. So you might as well be sort of conscious about it.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just the honesty about it that I love, of just like, you can't do everything. And so let's it is taking back a little bit of ownership and a little bit of, you know, as much as you can imagine it or perceive it, a little bit of control over your situation of like, cool, I can't do everything. And so here are the things that I am going to fail now at them by acknowledging it and letting it go. And then I'm going to go deep onto these other things. So that's really good.
You know, and if you want to, like, schedule a 2-hour mini retreat with yourself every quarter where you say, okay, is it time to change these priorities, right? And then at least if you know that's coming up, I think some people worry about this approach because they do fear that they will just sort of abandon important things forever. But none of this needs to be forever. Right. It just needs to be for a little while.
Yeah. That's really good. Really good. Okay. Next one.
Number 4 is focus on, hang on, get the wording. Focus on what you've already completed, not just on what's left to complete. This is a thing that's been really important to me. It might be a little bit sort of TMI about my hang-ups and
I love
psychological issues, but
no, it's good. That's what this show's for.
I mean, I think most people, certainly it's true of me, but when I talk to people about it, it seems to resonate with a lot of people. I think a lot of us sort of wake up in the morning with some vague sense that we're in a kind of existential productivity debt, that you then have to get a whole ton of things done that day, just in order to kind of justify your existence on the planet and get back up to like zero balance in your accounts with the cosmos. And of course, if you're being paid by a client or by an employer, you do have a certain kind of productivity debt. Like, you do actually owe people your work, but this existential version is something that we add to it, I think.
Yes.
This feeling that if I didn't get to the end of the day and feel like I really moved the needle on things and shipped some product, then I'm like, don't quite have the right to be here. So what I'm suggesting in that section is just, okay, whatever, you're probably not going to cure that completely, and it probably does sort of motivate in some way, but at least shift some of the focus onto what you've done. In other words, simple way to do this obviously is just alongside your lists of things to do, keep a done list, keep a list of what you do each day, so that things once completed get sort of presented on a list where you can see them accumulating, and you can see that, you know, you could have done nothing today, but instead you did all these things. And you can sort of begin to reframe it a bit so that, again, to come back to the kind of idea of being in debt, why not approach this in the spirit that you wake up in the morning at zero balance, and that everything you do is a sort of additional credit to your account and taking you further into the black, right? Instead of just sort of scrambling to keep up. I think that feeling of sort of being on the back foot and needing to work a huge amount today or this week or whatever, just to stand still in a way, is a really sort of tyrannical kind of psychological stance to take with yourself.
Yeah.
And that, you know, people want stuff from you, and if you're being paid for stuff, obviously you do have to provide things. It's not like we are free of those kinds of pressures and obligations. But like, consider waking up in the morning and thinking like, okay, I don't need to do anything at all today, and that means that everything I do is extra. Is something I'm bringing into the world because it's cool to do it, and an expression of my creativity, and an expression of my interests and passions. Instead of this like, oh my goodness, it's 6 o'clock. Have I managed to sort of, just about justify my existence for another day?
Yeah. In a lot of ways, it's like separating, a lot of what you do from your identity. I think that there's so much connection to like, am I worthy of love or existence or whatever choose your word if I don't achieve X, you know?
Right.
And that really is nefarious. And it does like really, you know, I know for me personally, like I have to, I've gone to therapy for it. Like I've really struggled with like, what am I without my work? What am I without achievement and doing? And it's a very hard lesson to learn, but I just feel like it's vital to, I love that, hitting reset a little bit every day. Like, well, it's a fresh start. And also like to your point, like acknowledging what you have achieved is also, and it doesn't have to be like work related. It's just like, you know, I did a good job taking care of my kids yesterday, or I did a good job of being a present friend yesterday. Things that are a little bit more intangible. Maybe they don't like quote unquote move the needle or whatever on your productivity necessarily, but it generated something positive into your world, into the lives of others. And like that counts for something too, that's worthy of like acknowledging and not just like brushing past to go do the next thing. So that's really good.
Absolutely. Next on number 5, consolidate your caring. And this is just this idea that one of the ways in which we live in a sort of world of infinite inputs, and the way this makes it very hard for finite beings to find a way to cope, is that we get an infinite number of claims on our compassion and claims on our charitable donations or our volunteering time or just our sort of feeling for people who are suffering in the world. And that anyone who sort of wants to be a decent person and is connected to these things is going to receive, 1,000 fundraising requests in email and 1,000 tweets about important causes. And it's sort of built into the attention economy that every single one of them is going to claim that they're the most deserving because they've got to. You've got to, like if you run a nonprofit that's fighting for voting rights, say, or, environmental protection, like you're never going to say that cause is that's like the third most important one facing America at the moment. It's always going to be the first because that's how the competition for eyeballs has to work. And so really in the same way that I'm talking about, picking a few projects and accepting that you're not going to do all of the cool things you can think of, I think there's something to be said for picking a cause or two, a couple of things that you're interested in as an activist or a donor or a volunteer, and kind of being fine with neglecting all the others in order to be more effective with them, and not needing to conclude from that not being a case of sort of ignoring people in need or things that matter. So like, maybe climate change isn't your focus because, I'm just picking causes out of my head at random here, but like, because, immigrants' rights is, or something like this, whatever it is. It's like, if you're the kind of person who wants to be a sort of decent citizen and you just think, well, anything that seems like it needs my attention and my donations has to get it. In the world as it is today, you will go insane because, the greatest saints in history hundreds of years ago were never asked to care about as much as we're all asked to care about. Similarly, I think there's a case to be made for like paying no attention to politics. If you're pouring your energies into something that makes the world a better place instead. And that's a very controversial view these days because, with, especially in America, the way politics are, there's a sense that like, if you're not fighting, like how irresponsible is that? Yeah. But I think that's kind of a attitude that comes from a time when we didn't have this degree of sort of overload of our attentional circuits. Totally. So I feel like people should go a bit more easy on themselves in that regard too, if that's an issue for them. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And like also just acknowledging like, the human mind isn't designed to not only we're not designed to know about every emergency happening across the world at all times, but we're also really not designed to go fix all of them, and like and to your point, it's like it can become, if you don't just accept that from the top and you just feel this need to go solve I think there's a lot to be said about choosing a couple things and like really pouring your life into those and helping the world be a better place. But yeah, we can't all be heroes for everything. You have to really be selective in that. And everyone's fighting for attention the same way, just to your point. So yeah, that's a good one as well. Number 6, embrace boring and single purpose technology. This can be done super quickly. I think one of the best ways to combat the sort of worst aspects of digital distraction and the attention economy, I think is at the level of the device. If you can, I think the Kindle is actually great for this, right? This is a device that doesn't really allow you to, when you're struggling with a difficult part of something you're reading, to just sort of go and surf the web and download some music or watch some videos instead. Yeah. You can, I talk also in there about putting your smartphone onto black and white instead of color, which sort of just like makes it
less interesting,
quite swiftly less appealing.
Right.
In the sort of, you still use it for the things that it's useful for, but you're not sort of like, it's kind of, it says something quite alarming about the psychology of sort of intelligent adults. So the moment that device is just in black and white instead of color, like, oh, it's not so interesting to read. Or, and I think taking social media apps off your phone and accessing them only through the desktop or a laptop, I think that's a really useful technique. But again, it's the principle of the thing, which is like the technologies that we are experiencing more and more are sort of capable of, they offer sort of 1,000 different things, 1,000 different avenues to pursue. That's a selling point, right? That you can do more things with a device than the previous generation of that device. But in fact, one of the big challenges of doing certainly sort of creative work is holding yourself, gently but for real on the thing you're doing and not providing yourself with these other avenues to escape. So, I mean, part of that is willpower, but willpower is pretty limited. And a much better one is like, okay, I'm sitting in the yard reading this book on an e-reader. If I really want to go and scroll through Twitter, I'm going to have to like
go
get
inside.
Up, go inside.
Yeah.
And the effort then is harder, and then the effort of distracting yourself is actually greater than the effort of continuing to focus.
For sure. Yeah. Willpower is a really bad plan. That's not really a plan, So
right.
That one's good.
Exactly.
Yeah. Cool.
Then I say, seek out novelty in the mundane. So this speaks to this problem with time experience, recollected time. Anyone who's older than about 25, maybe younger, has this experience of like time speeding up, so that the memory of time when you were a kid, summers seem to last forever. By the time you're in your 30s, like a week just seems to flash by and no time at all. And then, this experience, this is more pronounced the older that you get. And, elderly people report like, extraordinarily terrifying thoughts of like, well, where the last year go? Just nowhere. And one of the main, I think, leading theories for why this happens is that we approximate duration in our memory in terms of how much new data we have to process, right?
Yeah.
So that if an experience is new to you, then time will feel very expansive and leisurely when you think about it. And if an experience is mundane to you, you're sort of not paying attention to it. And the memory of that time will be very fast. I think it's easy to see this. If you think about just anywhere you travel, people maybe haven't traveled as much recently, but if you go somewhere for 3 days, you really remember that in your mind as like a chapter in your experience. If you go somewhere new and interesting for just even a short amount of time. But 3 days in your regular life can sort of flash by and you don't realize, it doesn't feel like you did anything with them at all. So anyway, people often recommend that you should do lots of new and exotic things for that reason. And they're right, but it can be impractical, obviously, to spend your entire life doing new and exotic things. So an insight I'm borrowing here from Shinzen Young, the meditation teacher, is just that you can sort of achieve the same effect by training your attention to sort of take in more data from the things you're doing anyway, which is one definition of a certain kind of mindfulness meditation, I think, just paying more attention. And then I think all sorts of practices like, journaling, photography, hanging out with toddlers, if you have them in your life, or taking different routes to work. There are all sorts of ways to just up the degree of focus that you're bringing to even ordinary circumstances. And one big upside of that is to combat this sense of time accelerating as you get older.
That's
Should
good.
I just keep going?
Yeah. We're on number 8. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
This is to be a researcher in relationships. I'll just read a tiny bit here because I think I can't put it much any better than I already did. So, the desire to feel securely in control of how our time unfolds causes numerous problems in relationships, not just in overtly controlling behavior, but in commitment phobia, the inability to listen, boredom, or the desire for so much personal control over your time that you miss out on all the enriching experiences of being in community. So I think there's a big problem generally with this sort of time mastery when it comes to relations with other people, because part of being in a productive, fulfilling relationship, romantic, friend, anything, parenting, is to do with not being in control or total control of how the experiences unfold. So this idea, which comes from ultimately from a preschool education expert, but I don't think it only applies to preschoolers, Tom Hobson. It's just this idea that curiosity is a really helpful stance to try to cultivate in a relationship. So, to just sort of interact with your kid or a friend or your spouse or a family member, extended family member who you might enjoy or not enjoy spending time with, just in the spirit of like, oh, I wonder how this will unfold. I wonder where this is going to go. I wonder what we're going to, instead of, I really want it to go this way. And then if it doesn't, getting really stressed and anxious. So I just think curiosity is an incredibly powerful concept because it's a form of engagement with experience that is kind of non-directive in a way that can be very useful. You don't have to choose between trying to control experience or just sort of passively zoning out and not really being there. You can be engaged without that level of directive.
No, that's so good. Yeah. And I think too, there's like a lot of, if you're, for me, I think of like the times when it's like, oh, it's a thing I don't want to do, like a meeting I don't want to have, or, some social obligation that I don't want to go to because time is so important to me or whatever. It becomes so much more fun and fulfilling if I'm there and I'm curious about the people or the situation or the thing I'm actually experiencing. And it's like, cool. I love that perspective of curiosity of I think that is huge. And that makes everything more enjoyable. And to your earlier point, just more novel of like, this is going to be more memorable. I'm going to have a better experience for like situations like this in the future. Now my orientation to the, it'll just be better all the way around. That's really good.
Yeah, totally agree. Then the next one, the penultimate one is to cultivate instantaneous generosity. This is the one where I feel I always have to issue the caveat that I feel like I'm still totally just at beginner stage with this, but it comes from the meditation teacher, Joseph Goldstein, who has this practice he's talked about, which is that if he feels a generous impulse, so the desire to give money to a good cause or to a panhandler or to send a message to somebody who he appreciates in his life or to compliment somebody on their work or whatever it might be, to act on that impulse immediately rather than later. Because I think many of us have this experience that we're actually pretty like grateful and generous people, right? We do go through life like reading something someone wrote or seeing somebody do some certain kind of work and like thinking it's really good or seeing someone who's suffering and feeling bad for them. Like, we're not mean,
right?
But you tend to tell yourself things like, well, I haven't got time for that, or the really sort of sneaky one that I recognized in myself a lot, which is like, I'm not going to do that now because soon I'm going to become the kind of person who does that all the time in a really sort of, I'm going to have a system for doing it.
Right. Yeah.
I'm going to have like a portion of the day. I'm going to have a practice where every day I sort of reach out to someone and tell them I admire their work or something. It's like, yeah, great if you can do it.
Yeah.
But if you use that as a reason to not even do it once, it's totally ridiculous, right?
I've literally done this.
Right.
I've literally in my planner or whatever, I've been like, cool, every day I'm going to take 10 minutes to write out messages to people who I love, who I'm thinking about, sending them good things. But I'm going to get to that next week when I have a little bit more time.
Yeah.
Like, I've literally done this.
Yeah, right. It's crazy, but I think it's some version of it is pretty widespread. It's not that you shouldn't have that practice. It's that you shouldn't use the belief that you're going to implement that practice later as a reason to not do one thing now, right? Just do one thing now. And a funny thing about this book, I honestly didn't mean it this way, but I put this as almost the very last thing in the book. Like, if you like someone's work, you should reach out to them and tell them. And like, I swear, like a bunch of people have emailed me and mentioned that the reason they're doing it is because I said this thing towards the end of the book to say like, they really like the book. So, I mean, I'm very happy about that because it's good for my ego to be complimented, but kind of funny. And then the last one of these in this list is to practice doing nothing. I think that a big part of we're talking about sort of the discomfort of sort of refraining from working on all your projects or from trying to save the world in every respect or from all the rest of it. It's kind of it's a refraining from action that is actually a very useful skill to cultivate. Not so that you can just spend your life doing nothing, obviously, so you can focus on doing some really cool things. But I think that a good way to sort of train that ability is to literally practice doing nothing. There is this form of meditation, which Shinzen Young calls do nothing meditation, but which also goes by non-directive meditation. There are a bunch of different versions, but it's like even simpler than sit down and focus on your breath for 10 minutes. It's sit down and don't do anything for 10 minutes. And if you catch yourself doing something like thinking or focusing on your breath or fidgeting, fine, but just stop doing that thing. And whenever you notice yourself doing something, just stop doing it. And it's quite interesting and sort of difficult to just sort of sit in a chair and well, you fail. I mean, you certainly won't succeed in doing nothing, but that's kind of the point, right? You're sort of practicing, you train the muscle through the failure as a result of the failure. But for anyone with experience of sort of conventional meditation, where you're focusing on the feeling of the breath in the nostrils or in the abdomen, you come to realize that in a way, that makes it a little bit easier because you've got something to do. And it's actually incredibly interestingly challenging to try to sort of have nothing to do. But I always find when I can, I'm not going to claim I have a daily sort of really rigorous practice of non-directive meditation, but when I do it, like 20 minutes in the morning, the day is very different because something in me is like triggered for that day that allows me to, be a bit more likely to hold back from just frenetic action and to sort of, sometimes it's to do with some process that just takes a longer to do than I would like it to take, and it enables you to stick with it. Yeah. Sometimes it's like not reacting in anger or irritation, but just sort of stopping. It's just a very good skill to have in your skill set, I think.
Yeah, I love that. I've heard, I think it was Naval Ravikant, famous investor. Yeah. He talks a lot about his meditation practice, and he's like, I don't focus on my breathing. It's just an hour a day where he sits down and he just doesn't do anything. And he's like, basically his thoughts just come and go. And it's just like totally letting his mind be free for an hour. And he says like the first 20 or 30 minutes of that is like pretty excruciating because it's all this noise and chatter and crazy talk happening of just the human mind doing its thing. But then the second half of that, it's like this level of peacefulness that then carries out throughout the day, to your point.
Yeah, no, I think, and don't think I've heard him talk about it, but I've heard various people talk about his approach, and it sounds very much in tune with it.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. All those steps are so helpful, and I appreciate you going through them. I just have one more question, and you don't have to take too long, but I am curious, like, why did you choose to write this book? Like, there's no shortage of time management books out there, and I think your approach was very different and unique, and it definitely struck a different chord. But I'm curious why you chose this topic of all the things you could have written about.
Well, as I sort of hinted earlier, I think it is, we're interested in the things we struggle with rather than the things that we find easy. And this is, this kind of thing of being like a productivity geek, investing all my time and energy in trying to find the right systems and things. That was a thing for me. I think it's just my and some other people's manifestation of a universal thing, right? Which is this universal kind of discomfort we have at being the way we are as humans in finite time with sort of, again, possibility of thinking of infinite things, but only doing a finite number. So then it sort of seems to me like, well, how could you not be interested in this, right? This is just like the human condition, right? Well, it's so I'm putting it through the lens of time management, firstly, because that's what speaks to me. And secondly, because you need some lens in a book like this. Otherwise it's just like, here's my philosophy of life. And it's not very, not very readable. But yeah, I think this goes pretty deep to the core of the things I personally have struggled with. You don't sound like you're completely dissimilar in terms of self-worth being wrapped up with work, and this notion that like if you could just find the right methods and also wake up tomorrow with like twice as much self-discipline as you've ever displayed before in your life, which is another part of this, but like then this would all be seamless and life you wouldn't need to feel uncertain or afraid about things. And one of the things I write about in the book was this kind of moment of realizing, oh, hang on, like big decisions in adulthood just are scary, right? They're not, You're not going to build systems that enable you to not be intimidated by the prospect of like marriage or buying an apartment or having kids. Like these are like scary decisions that adulthood involves that you've never done before. And therefore you're totally unprepared for on some level. And if that kind of thing you're trying to imagine is going to be solved by how you're organizing your life or setting your goals or something, I think you're sort of probably sorely mistaken, because it's kind of built in. So yeah, it was all, it's basically just all sorts of therapy related issues of mine coming into focus. But then I think I was really lucky in a weird way. It sounds like a callous thing to say about coronavirus, but I think the time that this book has been finally finished and come out into the world is one where a lot of people are sort of reevaluating how they want to be spending their time. So I think these are sort of timeless issues, but there are periods in history when people sort of brush them under the rug. And that's, I think, not what's happening now. I think it's they've been brought out from under the rug.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've been really inspired. I've had so many friends who, they were working jobs they hated or living in a city they didn't want to live in anymore or whatever. And I feel like in such a dark time in the world and in history, one little bright spot in that is that it did cause a lot of really healthy self-reflection of like, what am I doing with my time? And and I think your book is just a shining example of that. And it's just I felt it's a very healthy acknowledgement of reality while also being very helpful as far as like guiding you to being more productive on the things that matter. So I really appreciate you being on, Oliver. Where can people find you? Where do you want people to buy the book? Just give me all the plugs. Where should people go?
I want people to buy the book anywhere as long as they buy the book. In hardcover, audiobook, ebook formats. You can find out more about me at my website, oliverburkeman.com, and there's a whole longer write-up about the book and nice things people have been saying about it. And then I'm also at Oliver Burkeman on Twitter.
Yes. And I can say to everybody, I got the Kindle and the Audible, the audio version of the book, and they're both fantastic. So I highly recommend that. So awesome. Oliver, brilliant. Thank you again so much for being on. And thank you for everybody for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and want to get more of these conversations sent directly to your inbox, head over to alexsugg.com and sign up for my newsletter. And as always, please go leave a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts for this show. And last but not least, this episode was edited and produced by Josh Perez. And if you are a podcaster and if you're looking for help with your podcast, Josh is your guy. He's a great producer and an even better dude. So get in touch with him at justjoshperez.com for help there. And I will be back soon with another new episode. So until then, let's go make something cool. This episode of Make Something Cool was brought to you by Riverside, the leading podcast and video recording platform. To learn more, check out the link in the show notes or the description of this video or podcast.